So what's something that sex, drugs, and spirituality could all have in common? Right? Because most people are aware of these three topics, but they assume they are very different. And they are different activities, but at the core, could they all have something very significant in common?
There is no spoon.
And could that be why we've all at least indulged in one of them, if not all three of them?
Buddha punch. I need some Buddha.
At the same time. I'll start with spirituality and sex. So look at it like this. In the beginning, you have your clothes on and they have their clothes on, right? And normally, with any other stranger, your nakedness is an egocentric thing. I can't let me see them. There's a barrier. Me and them. But in the beginning of sex, as you're taking your clothes off, this barrier is dropped. Not just the panties, but this barrier is dropped. This egocentric self of I am naked in front of them. Now your nakedness is their nakedness, right? A two have become one. There's no ego about it. There's no self about that. As the process carries on, a love being a two becoming one, a selflessness, a physical altercation happens, we'll put it that way for YouTube's sake, where the two have become one in that way, in a physical sense, as close as they can physically to becoming one. Love. So in this interaction of sex, multiple barriers of self are being dropped, right? And at the climax, when both people are at that climax, we'll put it that way, notice, if you haven't, how when you're orgasming, there's no self about it. You're just purely and utterly present, right? That's why you are so attracted. It's not that sex necessarily just feels good. It does, but we're going to that place because at the climax, there's no self. There's no time. You're utterly present, and there's just no self about it. So much so that your mouth might even open when you're like, and it's no different with a joyride. When you're at the peak of a thrill ride and the sense of self is building up, this tension is building up, and right when it crashes and you realize you're going to be okay, that sense of self drops and it's just a bliss. Your mouth might even open then. You're dropping that sense of self. So even on that joyride, you think it's because it feels great being terrified, like you would in sex, think it's just the great feeling you're going for. But really it's at the climax. How there is no self. That's what that spot is. That's why in sex and in spirituality, the two have very much to do with each other.
Spiritual tools.
Because in spirituality and meditation, what's occurring? There's also a two becoming one.
Touched.
Because in that meditation, in that recognition, you are recognizing how I and reality are one. They are not two. They are non-dual in that way. It's a two becoming one. And just like in sex, anytime a two become one, there's a great bliss in that. An opportunity, right? That spot that we're all craving. So in meditation and that recognition, there is no time, there is no sense of self, and a two has become one in that way. So how would drugs have anything to do with this?
Into a Vegas hotel.
Notice how, whether it's alcohol or any other kind of substance, that after you've consumed enough to feel satisfied, no longer do you need. You need not, right? So even at the peak of any drug, of any high, you're craving that space of no self. No mind about it, right? When you're intoxicated or you're under the influence, it's a lot easier oftentimes to just brush things off and not be a mind about it, right? Of course, depending on the substance, you can overreact, but just notice something. In the peak of your high, or when you're drunk, you can actually be meditative in it.
I sure hope so.
Just sit with yourself. You don't need anything else because there's just no sense of self there, off and on, really, anymore about it. That sense of self has just been satisfied in a way to where it can kind of drop itself and relax. Of course, you can also act very stupid and ignorant, intoxicated. But my point is, just recognize how oftentimes at the peak of any kind of high where you have satisfaction, there's just no self in that. And usually no sense of time. So I think it's significant to understand how in spirituality and sex and in drugs, there's a common factor. There's something that we all crave. And that's most likely, in my opinion, why we all go towards them. Even in, let's say, sports, for example, the zone, that place that people get into where there's no longer time. They're no longer a mind about it. They're just action and reaction. That's a kind of selflessness. They're not necessarily playing the sport to win. They're playing to find that zone. The win is just a bliss, a kind of excitement to add on afterwards, right? And the loss can, of course, shatter you and take you out of that zone. And you could say, well, of course they're playing to win. Yes, your motive could be to win, but what draws people to that sport, to that engagement, whether it's a sport, a card game, a board game, is the process in the middle. It's not necessarily just the win or the loss at the end. That can add on to this kind of climax of no self and the zone, but we're all playing for the process, the playing, the play in the middle, right? Almost guarantee you, if you ask any professional, whether it's in boxing, football, basketball, baseball, soccer, would they rather have for eternity all of the wins but never get to experience any of the game, or would they have rather experienced all of the games and never known any of the outcomes? What would they have rather done? I guarantee you almost every one of them would have chosen to play the game. Right? To just play the game. Because in playing the game, and in the win, you still have what? The zone. But you can't have the zone with just a stat, with just a win. And that may be even why some people are so attracted to the game, because even in a loss, it can be so shattering that there is no self. It's humbling. Also note, just for podcast talk's sake, because we are going to start doing more of those live, that the yogis, when you see them smoking cannabis, why do you think they're inhaling that drug, that substance? Because it can go one of two ways. When you smoke cannabis, you're either going to become very nervous, anxiety-filled, and shaky, egotistical, fearful, or you're going to let go of that, relax, and it's just a different kind of openness. There's no time about it. You can become very meditative and just in the zone on cannabis. That's why some people can be so creative. They're so much more creative after smoking. When in reality, their aim is to find that spot at the high of, let's say, a cannabis session, for YouTube's sake, and then go back when you're sober and find that same spot. Completely sober, find that spot, the zone. That spot is what spirituality, sex, drugs, sports, all have in common. Which is important to notice how, in the same way you can become addicted to a drug, to a substance, you are addicted to looking away from the present, from just being present. You are addicted to doing something. You feel like you have to do something and look away from being present in order to feel whole. To feel fulfilled, you have to look away. You have to go do something. That in itself is an addiction. Most people don't recognize that. They don't take the time to notice within themselves that itch, that urge to go outward, that addiction. But looking away, not being able to be present while you're doing something, is an addiction in itself. It's a disease, a dis-ease. It's something that you can't help any longer. You've done it so much since birth, it's repetitive habit. For you to just move in unconscious action. Like some other videos talked about, you can move in conscious action where you are being present when you are reaching for your cup of tea or talking, or you can be speaking or moving in unconscious action, right? Where you're mechanically talking, mechanically reaching for your cup of tea. You're unconscious in that action. Most of our action is unconscious mechanical action. It's a looking away from being present. That's very significant to understand. And oftentimes that activity of sex or drugs is a way to look away. And in that looking away, at the climax, you find no self again. That drops. But in all activities, in any outward activity, we are looking away to find that spot again, the zone. Because we don't necessarily have the self-discipline or self-realization to recognize how none of those outward objects are going to fulfill anything. They can't in that way. It's an unconscious action, an unconscious habit, an addiction. So in all three of those topics, those areas, at the core is that sense of no self, just wholeness. When I say no self, I mean not being specifically identified with just the body. In that moment, you are awareness, just this openness, hope. Your self is the self. So it's not that you don't have a self, it's just that you are the whole, the self. Yeah.